and the CENTCOM commander, a row subsequently fueled by Franks' decision to halt some of his divisions that night.
In the interest of not allowing one division to get too far ahead to expose its flanks, Franks has got to stop some of his formations to let others catch up.
The main reason why Franks decided to halt his divisions at night on certain occasions was not fear of enemy action, but rather fear of blue-on-blue incidents, friendly fire incidents from his own forces in confused night fighting operations.
The sheer speed of advance achieved by coalition forces made it increasingly difficult to identify them from enemy ones on this now fluid battlefield. Unfortunately, several friendly fire incidents resulted. On the afternoon of the 26th of February, for example, an American A-10 Warthog plane destroyed 2 British Warrior armoured vehicles, killing 9 soldiers. These sad incidents highlighted the fact that friendly fire now represented as great a threat to the coalition as the enemy.
It was very difficult to actually recognise who was friendly and who was enemy on the battlefield. The technology at the time, which had very much developed as a result of the Vietnam War, was directed towards finding out what movement there was on the battlefield. But it didn't differentiate between friendly forces and enemy forces. And often when quick decisions are required on the battlefield, very chaotic, very high odds, mistakes were made.
In the Gulf War, the level of casualties from enemy fire to the coalition forces was very, very low. And that meant that deaths from friendly fire became a much larger proportion of those killed. If the enemy isn't killing your people, then the few who are killed by friendly fire become a larger proportion of the statistics.
During the 27th of February, the 7th and 18th US Corps thrust into western Kuwait to converge on the coalition forces then advancing north beyond Kuwait City along the eastern seaboard. Late that day, however, shocking images began to flood the world's media, depicting the carnage that coalition air power had inflicted on the Iraqi forces who had attempted to escape from Kuwait north along the Basra Road. In what became known as the Basra Road Syndrome, these images quickly altered world opinion, creating the belief that the war had degenerated into the murderous rout of a beaten force by the awesomely powerful coalition. Fearing a powerful political backlash, consequently the coalition announced a ceasefire at 8 a.m. on the 28th of February, exactly 100 hours after the ground campaign had begun. Throughout this 4-day ground campaign, coalition forces had encountered only modest Iraqi resistance. This fact goes a long way to explaining the unbelievably low casualty rate that the coalition suffered in the conflict, with a total of just 170 battle casualties. In fact, the Iraqis, despite their significant forces and modern equipment, performed unimpressively during the conflict, as evidenced by the capture of 48,000 Iraqi soldiers in just 100 hours of battle.
There is a brilliant computer model which in recent years has shown that if you model the battles of the Gulf War on a computer, and if on that computer you increase the level of Iraqi training, suddenly the war is much less one-sided than it was. It's not so much that the Iraqi soldier was less motivated than the coalition soldier, although he was. The real difference in the Gulf War comes from the fact that the coalition soldiers were very much better trained than the Iraqi soldiers.
On the day following the ceasefire, Iraq announced its compliance with all the UN resolutions concerning the invasion of Kuwait. Soon after, the Shiite and Kurdish minorities in southern and northern Iraq respectively rose up in rebellion against Saddam. However, the coalition, now anxious to disengage from the region, refused to intervene in what they described as an internal Iraqi affair. This disinterest encouraged Saddam, who dispatched his surviving Republican guards to suppress these rebellions. Then, in the following months, UN weapons inspectors began the difficult job of locating and dismantling Saddam's facility for making nuclear, biological and chemical weapons.
The defeat doesn't necessarily erode Saddam's control over Iraq. In many ways, it reinforces it. Partly because it enables Saddam to square the circle that he'd been facing since the end of the Iran-Iraq war, in that he told the Iraqis they'd won a great victory, but their economy and their standard of living was severely damaged. Now he has a wonderful excuse for Iraq's problems in the form of the coalition and what it's done.
Saddam remained in power. The subsequent attempts to dismantle his weapons of mass destruction, his chemical, biological and possibly nuclear capabilities, met with some success, but faced constant bureaucratic obstruction and prevarication from within Iraq.
At the strategic level, the Gulf War was an unqualified success. Saddam Hussein could not control the price of oil in the world. At an operational level, it did not achieve all of its aims, but it doesn't matter. As long as you achieve your strategic aims, then you can walk away and say that that was a victory.
Today, Saddam Hussein still controls Iraq and still seems to pose a threat to the region. Through dogged obstructionism, Saddam eventually even managed to rid himself of the UN weapons inspectors. In their absence, Iraq has reportedly begun to rebuild its weapons of mass destruction.